Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are happy to have you here to join us for this engaging discussion with two experts on water resources and climate change. My name is Catherine Farr, and I'm the coordinator for the Oxford Water Network, which brings together researchers addressing climate challenges across the University of Oxford. As part of our Hillary Term seminar series, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Alex Guerra Noriega, Director of the Climate Change Research Institute, and Samantha Boardley, a climate change adaptation consultant, both of whom are alums from Oxford's Water Science Policy and Management, or WSPM, master's program. Alex has been the General Director of the Climate Change Research Institute in Guatemala since 2010. After finishing his master's, he stayed at Oxford for his PhD in Geography and the Environment. His work and that of the institute he directs focuses on applied research and looks at local scale challenges posed by climate change in Guatemala and more recently El Salvador. And ask that everyone who's joining please mute their microphone. As director of ICC, Alex co-founded the Guatemalan Climate Change Science System in 2014 and also co-founded the Mesoamerican Journal of Biodiversity and Climate Change in 2017. Since Oxford, Samantha Boardley has built an impressive career as a consultant working on the environment, climate change, and development. She has advised partners from government, multilateral organizations, and NGOs on how to better plan, measure, learn from, and ultimately scale climate resilient development results. She has worked for the likes of the World Bank and UNDP, the governments of Ethiopia and Zambia, as well as a number of large international NGOs, including WaterAid, CARE, and the Equality Fund Initiative. As a trained evaluator, she has led a number of evaluations of large multi-country adaptation and resilience initiatives, learning what works and doesn't when it comes to building adaptive climate resilient systems and communities. Welcome to you both. It's great to have you here. And Alex, we can't quite see your screen if you want to turn it on. In the interest of time and being sure we can open up to questions from participants, I'm going to ask you to keep your responses to the initial questions to 5 minutes. And I'd like to remind participants that information for accessing our Slido link for the Q&A is in the chat. We encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A and to vote on questions that are already there that you'd like to have answered. So Samantha and Alex, the Oxford Water Network seminar series this year is entitled Water, Society, and Policy. And I'd like to start by examining how these three elements relate to climate change. So how should society and policy groups be thinking about water and climate change? Are there any of the responses working particularly well or not working as expected? And why is adaptation important to society's functioning? Samantha, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and welcome everybody. Thanks so much for participating this morning. As an adaptation practitioner, I've been in the space for a while now, and I've gotten this question quite a lot, right? In terms of why is adaptation important? Why do we need to be focused on this now? And I think about one particular instance about a decade ago, 2011 actually, when I got the exact same question from a group of community-based project managers in northern Ghana who were working on conservation agriculture. And I was there to facilitate a training session on climate change and climate change adaptation and climate smart agriculture. But at that time, actually, the Canadian government had just withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol back in 2011. So the tone of the question was a bit more, you know, why must we have to figure out and adjust and absorb and adapt to, you know, varying degrees and severities and intensities of these extreme weather and climate events when, you know, the solution is in you, the global north. I mean, stop emitting, right? This kind of the adaptation and mitigation debate, right? So in hindsight, I'm sure a conversation on climate justice was warranted at that time. But of course, I went on to talk about hypothetical scenarios that if GHG emissions are to stop tomorrow, we're looking at, using half-lives of GHGs and the rate of absorption of GHGs into our existing sinks, for example, I mean, we're locked in. We're already committed to a certain level of climate change. We have to adjust. All of our systems globally have to figure this out. So that was the context of the question like a decade ago, and now I feel like with this audience we don't need to say much more. I mean, this is it. We're living it. We see it in the news every day. The wildfires, the tropical cyclones. We need to adjust our systems reasonably. And I can provide a bit more context too in terms of the adaptation mitigation debate, because this is where I've been supporting some organizations to help track their progress towards meeting adaptation and mitigation targets, for example. And at risk of oversimplifying it, I mean, mitigation has received so much more attention because it's easier. I mean, we have a single universal culprit being GHGs. We understand the major sources from fossil fuel-based energy and transportation systems. We know how to measure it. We have measurement instruments, algorithms and equations that are advancing and becoming more sophisticated, but at least we have that baseline understanding and we know how to finance it. So typically through high capital physical infrastructure, hard assets, tech transfer that we can put a price tag to. So the mitigation challenge is the stuff that, us data heads dream about, but the adaptation side of things is the stuff that breaks our brains. It's messy, it's complicated, it's local, it's based on local context. We have no universal culprit. Adaptation must be different at the grassroots level, depending on local and microclimate drivers and risk profiles, for example. We have no universal metric really to measure adaptation. So we've looked at economic losses and number of people affected by disasters, but these indicators have significant data challenges, and they also have moral and ethical questions to it when it comes to economic losses related to the poor and marginalized, which will be the majority of those that suffer the consequences. So we had to go back to basics. We've got more quantitative indicators around number of people supported to cope with climate change and number of sectoral policies and plans adjusted, for example. So some pretty basic indicators at global scale to help us measure adaptive capacity and adaptation. So it's just messier, but in sum, I think, with this additional background and context, how we need to be thinking about water and climate change is the same way that we need to be thinking about adaptation and mitigation in terms of those co-benefits. Adaptation and mitigation co-benefits, we used to talk about almost as a placeholder. We didn't really pay them much attention, but I think they're coming really quite central now to our thinking around resilience, low carbon development, and now even in our thinking around circular economies and life cycle approaches, for example. So I think that's where we need to be focusing our attention, is on those adaptation mitigation co-benefits.
Oh, that's really great. Thank you, Samantha. And Alex, we'll turn the question over to you.
Okay. I think there are differences according to different scales of policies. For example, at the international level, I've been participating as a delegate from Guatemala in some of the COPs, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there I didn't see water playing a big role in the discussions. And it was very interesting in the last COP in Madrid, the Chile COP that you might remember happened in Madrid because of the instability in Chile. So I attended that, and of course I focused on the water-related events, and it was very, very interesting. And there was a question from the chair asking the Global Water Partnership executive director on whether the COP was getting blue, so incorporating the water element into it, and she said, I think it is, but it's not the right kind of blue yet. So I think at the international level, there are still communities of people, and they come, of course, from academics also. When you see it's a group of people who do the research, who talk to each other and define things their own way. So there have been separate communities around climate change, water resources, and then within climate change mitigation. So in the literature, more related to policy, I think there is less interaction. It is at the local level, especially with NGOs and people working on the ground, that you see the challenges and the opportunities. And that's where, of course, it's hard to define and label everything you do, because it might be interpreted, or you can read it through adaptation or through even development. That discussion about what is adaptation and what is development is very relevant in this sense. At the national level, of course, my experience has been in Central America, and then policy making is messy. I think it might be to some extent like that in other countries, even in developed countries, but politicians have their own interests and agendas, and so they don't have the intention of having the best information possible. And that's what, well, I'm gonna comment on that later on, but then this discussion about climate and water resources, it depends who is there and who has a say with particular politicians or particular ministers, for example, in putting forth some of the terms, challenges, and hopefully being aligned with the international policies. But then it is only through regulations, for example, for exports or for having access to specific funding or loans from international banks. That's when then governments at the national level create policy that is more relevant, and then they make a bigger effort in doing it according to the definitions and terms that are being discussed at the international level. And then, of course, that becomes a paper version of the policies. And then what happens on the ground is a different story. It takes time to be implemented. And so it is, for me, it's been fascinating as a scholar, sort of being immersed in this world at the local level, international level, and having contact with the different government entities, and even at the Central America level. For me, it's been amazing to see what goes on in all the discussions and the dynamics. So of course, I'm less of a scholar now, and I miss that a little bit about Oxford. But yeah, so there is this mix, and there are different ways that this interaction happens between the policymakers and the governments and people.
Oh, that's great, Alex, Sam, thank you both. So it sounds like it might be more accurate to say that mitigation is, from what both of you have said, is about reducing our impact on the planet, and adaptation and resilience is about adjusting to what climate change has brought, what we've already locked ourselves into, as Samantha said, and what it might be bringing based on how well we do with mitigation. So up to now, as you've both mentioned, climate change action has largely been focused on mitigation, with adaptation and water kind of playing a back seat. So what have been your observations and experiences? You've talked a little bit about this over the past decade, about the climate community's valuation of water availability and sustainability as a key component for climate resilient development, and what is the role of water resources when it comes to climate change mitigation, low carbon, green economic transformation. And Alex, we'll start with you, and I think you were talking a little bit about that connection of the climate change community at the COP and trying to bring it together with the water. So please.
Yeah, I'd like to first comment a little bit on what Sam said about mitigation. I completely agree that it's more advanced. There is metrics, and there is policies, and there is a market, not a very successful one in the case of the voluntary market, but there is a lot more going on. And there is an article that was published in Nature in 2007. I think it is included in the reading list for this event. It explains very well, I think, why mitigation is a lot more advanced and adaptation is lagging behind. And it had to do with sort of thinking about climate change into the future and not saying, if we think about adaptation, it is almost like saying, okay, let's keep changing the climate and we just adapt to it. So there was this taboo about talking about adaptation at the beginning. And so the focus went absolutely on mitigation. Of course, that makes sense because you need to address the root cause of the problem. And that's still, when you see the Paris Agreement, the first element in the objective of the Paris Agreement is still mitigation so that temperature doesn't go up more than 2 degrees and hopefully 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. So I agree on that. And I think going to the water role in the mitigation side is very recent. I've seen it more in discussions, maybe even in the past 5 years, at most 10 years. And then there is this partnership right now for sustainable water and energy solutions that I think you also included the link in the document. And it was launched at one of the COPs in 3 years ago only. And now there is a knowledge platform, and that's where they are trying to collect experiences, linking water and energy. And that's mainly that's maybe one of the most important ways in which water plays a role in the mitigation side. Of course, the first thing that comes to your to mind is power plants, so hydro energy. But it's not just that. Water also plays a role in other types of energy, and that's what I've been presenting at those side events at the COPs, and is how water plays a role with through biomass production. And that's something we've been studying in Guatemala and also in El Salvador. The carbon footprint of sugarcane production, the water footprint of sugarcane production, and also how the use of biomass from sugarcane contributes to reducing about 10% of our total emissions in the country. And it used to be waste. So it is great, and something that the sugar industry that produces sugar from sugarcane, because there's also beet sugar, is doing around the world, and it does have an impact on the mitigation side. So there are different ways, direct and indirect ways, in which water plays a role in mitigation. And even when you look at specific industries, and in agriculture, for example, reducing pumping or reducing diesel use in pumping water was one of the best mitigation practices that we identified. It made sense in terms of reduction of emissions, and also it was gonna cost less for people. So it had some economic benefits as well. So, and then you can use that same energy from biomass or even solar energy to pump irrigation in the agricultural field. So there is a lot to discuss and to showcase and to identify as in the role of water and mitigation, and not just through energy.
Thanks, Alex. That's really enlightening. And Samantha, I'll turn the question over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I really appreciate the mention of the biomass, the carbon and water footprinting of biomass, which is something that I haven't done a lot of work in, but I'm really interested to hear that's being kind of an area of study. And so I guess, you know, in response to the question around the climate community's valuation of water availability and sustainability, I mentioned before a little bit about, well, the adaptation mitigation co-benefits. And I like that Alex's examples kind of exemplified that. I might also contribute, you know, the increased focus that we're seeing on nature-based solutions, I think is a really fascinating area that's emerging from those intersections within the climate community. When we traditionally talk about the climate community, we've got your climate information science piece. As we were prepping for this call, I know there's some climate modelers, some hardcore climate modelers on this call, and we don't want to forget that piece either. And then we've got the adaptation and the mitigation groups as well. And then if we look at what's being developed at the intersections and the margins of those three spheres, we're getting some really interesting work. And I think the nature-based solutions is a really interesting one. I know in the UK recently, the government announced $3 billion over the next 5 years out of their international climate finance envelope for nature-based, for nature and biodiversity. I think there's a group out of Oxford that's already working on nature-based solutions. And so if you look at the types of ecosystem services that we're trying to protect and restore through those nature-based solutions, we're looking at services that promote and facilitate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, for example, the role of flood protection or the services of flood protection and water purification as offered through wetlands and foreshore areas and mangroves in terms of flood risk reduction, for example. And in the mitigation space, looking at services around carbon sequestration as generated through forests and more generally good soil and water management, for example. Here in Canada, we have something called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, MNAI, which is supports local governments to better quantify, value, and monetize those natural assets for the services that they provide, and help them to strengthen the business case for the inclusion of these services as part of their asset management planning, and therefore the business case for their better protection and preservation of these natural spaces. So that's the nature-based solutions piece, which I think is a really fascinating kind of nexus, certainly between adaptation and mitigation that's emerging. Another example that I've had the good fortune to work with quite a bit is more at the intersection of the climate information sciences and adaptation, and with some mitigation co-benefits as well. So the improved role of climate information services in reducing vulnerability of primarily rain-fed communities dependent on primarily rain-fed agriculture. So looking at water for agricultural purposes. As some of you might know, globally, there's been a big push to improve our global and national observational networks for climate data. And under the Global Framework for Climate Services, we've got a big push to improve capacity of national Met agencies to provide more timely, accurate, and user-friendly climate information services and products. And with that, what we're seeing is that we're seeing in the community, in the adaptation projects that I've been evaluating at the community scale, we're seeing improved access to short, medium, and long-range weather forecasts, which, you know, I live in a bit of a breadbasket area for Ontario and work with quite a few farmers here. And if you ask them during the growing season, of course, how many times we're checking the weather forecast, you know, it's dozens of times a day during that growing season. So it's basic information, but now it's getting into the hands of those that need it most. It's accessible via SMS and radio programs. It's available in local languages. Some communities are working on ensuring it's accessible to those who are illiterate, for example. And we're also seeing that more people know what to do with this information, how to use this information to better inform some of their agricultural decision making around what to plant, when to plant, where to plant, when to bring your livestock to higher ground, and the risk of flash flooding. So we're seeing Met agencies partner with agricultural departments to create agro advisories, and that of course is also, yeah, it's really neat. So I again, just in sum, I guess, with a couple of those examples, you know, we're seeing an increasing value of the role of water in delivering some of these quite elusive adaptation and mitigation co-benefits.
Thanks so much, Samantha. Alex, I'm going to direct the next question to you. I'd love for you to share some of the unique water and climate change challenges you've been working on with ICC for Latin America, specifically El Salvador and Guatemala.
Yes, of course. And I could talk for like 2 hours, but I'm just going to mention a couple of things in 5 minutes. Central America is like disaster lab for the world. We have all the hazards, except for those related to snowfall and ice. We have seismic, volcanic, and all the water related or weather or climate related hazards. We have them. And that was even before climate change was a problem. So it is something that you can see. Even the capital of Guatemala has been relocated 3 times because of disasters. And so that's something very, very important about this area of the world. And what climate change is doing is increasing, it seems, but you need, of course, long-term data in order to say statistically that that's happening, but at least the observation and the perception of everybody basically is that events are becoming more frequent and more intense. For example, last year we had 2 hurricanes within 2 weeks, 2 major hurricanes. That's just crazy. You know, people were still flooded from the previous hurricane, and then we had another one coming. It was just insane. And that's why there's very, very few exceptions of people who deny climate change because it's so obvious in Central America. But one thing that exacerbates vulnerability is the lack of water management. It's very ironic because it's a very water rich region. We have more than most countries if you look at the per capita figures of water. Maybe you've come across the evaluation about 3 years ago that the Global Water Partnership was doing with the UN in the level of integrated water resource management. It's a very, very interesting and useful way to see the level of implementation. It's related to the SDG, I think it's 6.5.1, the one related to integrated water management. And they ranked all the countries around the world. The world average isn't great. I believe it was 49 out of 100. That was the world average in implementation of integrated water management. But the average for Central America was 31, and both El Salvador and Guatemala had lower than that, so 25 and 23. And what does that mean in practice? We don't have a water law. We have pieces of legislation, but there are loopholes, there are contradictions, there is no authority. Nobody here issues licenses or permits. So there is something that I call water anarchy, because then you extract whatever you can and whatever you can access, whether it's groundwater or if you're close to a lake or a river. And so maybe that was fine when the population was very small, but now that population has increased and so water demand is higher, then we have a lot of conflicts. That's a very important problem. Conflicts and water scarcity, even in the rainy season. So it's crazy, and that's why any changes in the climate causes more impacts. So a delay of 2 or 3 weeks in the start of the rainy season that has impacts in production, especially crops for subsistent farmers. Of course, they are always the most vulnerable, but everyone, even the cash crops, you know, the export, everyone faces challenges and impacts very frequently. And that's why the Institute was created by the private sector as a way to respond and to see all the way from data generation. That's something we don't have either. There is very, very scarce information. So that's something we have a weather station network, for example. There is no information on river flow data. There is no identification of aquifers. So it is just wild. So there is no management, and that's why there are a lot of impacts. So they're more related to water management and development, but then of course the trigger comes from the climate, and so that's why we've been working on all these issues, from generation of primary data to capacity building at all levels, from community to companies, even Congress people, and even the president. I was telling you just before we started the event that even the previous president, we had to give a talk to, because there is not even knowledge about what water management is. So there is a lot to be done.
Yeah, Alex, it sounds like it's a ton. And it sounds like amazing work that you've been doing, and I really appreciate you sharing all that with us. I know you said you could talk for 2 hours, but unfortunately we don't have 2 hours. So I want to just move to the last
no, I finished them. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, I do just want to give a shout out. This will be the last set question. I know we've gotten a couple of questions already, but please do go ahead and use the chat to go ahead and submit your questions. So we've got some when we start the Q&A. And with that, Samantha, your final question. As a consultant, you have worked with a variety of multilaterals, NGOs, and governments. What are the common themes that you're seeing across the board? And are there any big differences in planning or implementing climate change adaptation and developing sustainable water availability that have been particularly striking to you?
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to make you work for this one too. I'm sure you're going to have to cut me off after a little bit, because similarly, I think both Alex and I can get pretty jazzed talking about this stuff, having the opportunity to share some of these stories that we've been observing and hearing ourselves. So to keep it brief, one common theme and one difference, let's say. So what I really appreciate that I'm seeing that, you know, was a movement from the grassroots, from the bottom up, would be this lens on climate justice and gender equality. I think that's something that is by nowhere near perfect, but I'm thrilled to see it in a lot of national climate change policies and plans and acts. The Kenya Climate Change Act that was signed in 2016 also commits to gender responsive programming and adaptation investment across sectors. So, and I think with that regard, you know, back my dissertation, my master's was 2007, and so a report that I cited as part of that dissertation was the Human Development Report on Climate Change in 2007. And that was one of the first kind of global publications that looked at, that acknowledged climate change as much more than an environmental challenge, but rather as a human development challenge. And I think since then we've got an increasing narrative around differential vulnerability, loss and damage, gender equality, now intergenerational equity, equality, which I think is also equally important. And as I say, well, that agenda was certainly driven mostly from civil society organizations and communities themselves. We're seeing some of that narrative built into the Paris Agreement, for example, which commits countries to ensuring that their programming is gender responsive and in the best interest of human rights, which includes gender equality and empowerment of women. Within the Green Climate Fund, you know, it is not without its challenges either, but at least we're seeing some movement to improve direct access for local level governments and community-based actors, which again, as we've discussed, is where the adaptation money is needed the most. Even recently, I was looking at the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development. They're developing some guidance on gender responsive green growth in the private sector, which is looking at ensuring that women are part of the dialogue, because with green economy, the risk is most of those interventions are focused on the formal sector, on sectors traditionally dominated by men through energy, construction, manufacturing, for example. So ensuring that we've got that gender lens on it. So if you're interested in this, I'll send around a link to Mary Robinson's podcast, Mothers of Invention, which is a really interesting kind of feminist podcast around climate change and vulnerability and risk. So quickly, so that's something that I'm really jazzed and excited to see kind of trickling throughout international, national, and subnational levels. One of the big challenges is still on the financing piece. There's still so much work in order to get money to where it's needed most for these communities to be able to implement what's typically small scale interventions, but that still have a price tag with it. So quickly, there's two problems here. The big players, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, have always, and even bilateral climate change funds, have always been inaccessible to local governments and communities, for example. There's always been too many strings attached, safeguard requirements that make it quite difficult. The other piece would be internally within countries, decentralization processes can be quite inefficient, ineffective, non-transparent. Payment transfers from the center to subnational have always been a struggle, and certainly not very transparent. And I ran into that in Burkina Faso, where some proposed budgets for disaster risk management and early warning systems at the community scale were being costed out at 500,000 to 750,000 pounds for the implementation of these plans. And when you try to get a sense for what the annual budget might be for a local municipality, it was impossible to find out. It was like crickets. I'm not entirely sure that people really knew the answer to that. I could only get consensus from those closest to the budget that that 500,000, 750,000 was entirely unreasonable to expect for this type of plan. But on a great, so decentralization is a big challenge in a country like Burkina Faso. But in Kenya, for example, there's some really, really interesting stuff that was piloted through the International Institute for Environment and Development. And at the local level, they have something called the county climate change funds, whereby once they get their annual budget.
Okay, you're well over time. Sorry, I've been trying to do all these subtle things. But it's great. No, it's okay. I love that you and Alex are so passionate about this. It's why we wanted to have you today. And so I don't mind that I'm having to, you said that I could, so I'm jumping in and cutting you off as promised. But this has been fantastic. And I'm really excited to hear the work that you've both done. Really excited to hear more. And thank you again, both for coming today. But we want to make sure that we have time to open up, and we're getting a lot of questions